On a cold Tuesday morning in February, the most famous fashion designer in the world stood in line at a laundromat in Queens, holding a bag of quarters while 40 million people online called her a thief. Nobody in that laundromat recognized her. Nobody ever had. Because for 11 years, she had built an empire without ever showing her face. No photos, no interviews, no name, just a label the entire industry worshipped. And now that same industry was tearing her apart for stealing a design. Here's the part that should make your skin crawl. The design they accused her of stealing was hers. Every stitch of it. And the only way to prove it was to destroy the one thing she had spent her whole life protecting. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand why the truth is sometimes the most expensive thing a person can own. Her name was Emma Hale. But you wouldn't know that name. Nobody did. The world knew her by one word. Aveline. If you've ever watched a red carpet, you've seen her work. First ladies wore Aveline. Movie stars begged for Aveline. When an Aveline gown appeared at the Met Gala, fashion editors would spend 3 days dissecting a single sleeve. Her pieces sold for more than most people's houses. Waiting lists stretched 2 years. And through all of it, over more than a decade, not one photograph of her existed. Not one interview. Not one confirmed sighting. The mystery only made her bigger. Magazines ran cover stories asking who Aveline really was. Some people swore she was a retired supermodel. Others said she was a collective, a whole team hiding behind one name. One conspiracy theory claimed she didn't exist at all, that the label was run by an algorithm. Emma used to read those theories on her lunch break and laugh into her coffee. Because here was the reality. Aveline was a 34-year-old woman who lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Queens, New York. She rode the subway. She bought day-old bread from the bakery on the corner because the owner, an old Polish woman named Wanda, gave her a discount. 3 days a week, she worked part-time at a small fabric shop, cutting cloth for strangers, giving sewing advice to nervous brides on a budget. Her coworkers thought she was just Emma. Quiet Emma, good with her hands, terrible at small talk. She wanted it that way, needed it actually. See, Emma had grown up watching what that world does to people. Her mother was a seamstress, one of the invisible ones, the women who sit in back rooms sewing gowns that other people take credit for. Emma spent her childhood on the floor of those back rooms, playing with fabric scraps while her mother's fingers bled into silk that would later walk down runways under someone else's name. Her mother worked for a designer everyone adored, a man with a beautiful smile and a famous face. And Emma watched that fame eat him alive. The parties, the pressure, the paranoia. She watched him scream at her mother over a crooked hem, then walk outside and charm a camera crew 30 seconds later. When Emma was 16, that man's empire collapsed in a scandal, and he took everyone down with him, including her mother, who lost 20 years of work in a single news cycle. No severance, no thank you, nothing. Her mother died 4 years later, and at the funeral, standing in a dress she had sewn herself, Emma made 2 promises. One, she would become the greatest designer alive because her mother's hands deserved a legacy. And 2, the world would never, ever own her face. So she built Aveline like a fortress. Only 3 people on Earth knew the truth. Her business manager, Marcus, a 60-year-old former lawyer who had known her mother and who handled every contract, every meeting, every dollar, and 2 clients. 2. A tech billionaire's wife and an aging Hollywood legend, both of whom had signed agreements so brutal that Marcus joked they'd lose their houses if they even dreamed about her name too loudly. Everyone else dealt with the label through lawyers, encrypted emails, and a studio in Manhattan that Emma visited only at night, through a service entrance, wearing clothes so plain that security guards looked right through her. For 11 years, it worked perfectly. She designed by day at a small desk by her apartment window on one laptop, an old gray machine covered in stickers from hardware stores. That laptop held everything. 11 years of sketches, unreleased collections, client measurements. Her entire life's work sat on that hard drive, and she guarded it like a dragon guards gold. Never on the cloud, never emailed. Marcus had begged her for years to use secure servers, and she always refused. "Servers get hacked," she told him. "A laptop in my hands does not." She was almost right. And that winter, she was working on the most important project of her life, the 10th anniversary collection, a tribute to her mother. She called it Northern Light, built around the aurora her mother had described from her childhood in a small town near the Arctic Circle, a sky her mother never saw again after coming to America. 40 pieces. 2 years of work, every gown carried some hidden piece of her mother's story, stitched where only Emma would ever know to look. It was the best work she had ever done. It was also sitting on one laptop, in one apartment, above one laundromat in Queens. And on the second Friday of November, it started to rain. You already know something bad is coming, but I promise you, it's not what you think. And it's so much worse than a broken computer. The rain that Friday came down like the sky had a grudge. Emma was walking home from the fabric shop with her laptop bag over her shoulder, the same route she'd walked 1,000 times. Half a block from home, a delivery truck hit a flooded pothole and sent a wall of gray water over the sidewalk, over her, over the bag. She sprinted the rest of the way, dried the laptop with a towel, held her breath, and pressed the power button. The screen flickered once, showed her a folder named Northern Light, and died. Black, silent, gone. Now, understand what that laptop meant. She had backups of the finished sketches on encrypted drives in a safe deposit box. Thank God, she wasn't reckless. But the working files, the unreleased revisions, the client notes, the fabric orders, the entire living body of the anniversary collection, all of it lived on that machine. And Fashion Week was coming. She didn't have weeks to wait for some certified corporate repair service that Marcus would arrange through 3 layers of lawyers. She had a broken laptop, a deadline, and a repair shop 2 blocks away with a sign in the window that said same-day service. The shop was called Ridgewood Tech. The guy behind the counter was maybe 26, friendly in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes, with a name tag that said Danny. He took one look at the laptop and said, "Water in the board, I can fix it. Come back at 7. Emma hesitated. Her whole life was on that machine. But the files were buried in folders with boring names. The sketches were mixed among thousands of ordinary images, and nothing on that laptop said Aveline. No logo, no label name. Just work files belonging to some woman named Emma. Who would even look? She told herself that. Standing at that counter, dripping rainwater on the floor, she told herself that. She came back at 7. The laptop worked. Danny smiled, charged her $140, and told her to have a good night. She checked the files on the walk home. Everything was there. Everything was fine. She actually stopped at Wanda's bakery and bought a whole fresh loaf to celebrate, not the day-old stuff. That's how relieved she was. What Emma didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Danny had a side business. When interesting machines came through his shop, machines with big design files, financial records, anything that smelled like money, Danny cloned the drives. All of them. It took him 20 minutes with the equipment in the back room. Most of the clones were worthless. Family photos, tax documents, homework. But that night, sorting through Emma's files in his apartment, Danny stopped chewing his food. Because he wasn't a fashion guy, but even he could tell these weren't homework. These were hundreds of professional gown designs, technical drawings, fabric specifications, the kind of files that looked expensive. He didn't know whose they were. He didn't care. He uploaded a sample batch to a marketplace on the dark web where stolen creative work gets sold, intellectual property with the serial numbers filed off, and he priced the full archive at $8,000. It sat there for 9 days. On the 10th day, someone bought it. The buyer's account had no name, just a handle. But behind that handle was a man named Richard Voss. You need to know who Richard Voss was, because men like him are the reason this story exists. Voss was the chief executive of a luxury house called Maison Vert, an old European label that had spent a decade dying slowly. Wrong trends, wrong designers, wrong everything. Voss had bet the company's future on a young star designer named Camille Ross. 29 years old, beautiful, magnetic, the industry's favorite new face. The problem was that Camille was a far better performer than she was a designer. Her last 2 collections had been savaged by critics. Investors were circling. Voss needed a miracle, and he needed it before Spring Fashion Week, or he was finished. Voss had people whose entire job was finding miracles in dark places. When one of them showed him the stolen archive, Voss scrolled through maybe 15 sketches before he stopped and got very quiet. He didn't know these were Aveline's designs. Nobody could have known. The files were anonymous. But Voss had spent 30 years around genius, and he knew he was looking at it. He paid the $8,000. $8,000 for 2 years of Emma's soul. Then he called Camille into his office, closed the door, and slid a tablet across the desk. And here's where Camille Ross had a choice. She looked at those designs and she knew the way every real professional knows that this level of work comes from somewhere. Someone's hands made this. She asked Voss one question. Is this going to come back on me? And Voss said, it's untraceable orphan work from a defunct studio. It's ours now. Camille looked at the sketches again. She thought about the reviews of her last collection, and she said, okay, one word, okay. Remember that word, because it's going to cost her everything. Maison Vert moved like a machine. Within 8 weeks, they had produced 22 pieces from the stolen archive, and they scheduled Camille's show for the opening slot of Spring Fashion Week. Meanwhile, across the river in Queens, Emma was working 18-hour days finishing the Real Northern Light collection, planning its debut for the final night of that same fashion week. The anniversary slot Marcus had negotiated a year in advance. She had no idea. No idea that her own designs were being cut and sewn in a rival's atelier. No idea that both versions of her life's tribute to her mother were about to walk down 2 different runways, 6 days apart. The night of Camille's show, Emma wasn't even watching. She was on her apartment floor, hand-finishing a hem, with a live stream playing on her phone mostly for background noise. She heard the applause start. She heard the commentators gasping. And then she heard a phrase that made her hand stop moving. A stunning gradient technique, like the northern lights dissolving into silk. Emma picked up the phone, and she watched her mother's memory walk down someone else's runway. Piece after piece, her sleeves, her seams, the exact dye gradient she had spent 5 months perfecting, the one that shifted from deep green to violet like the aurora over her mother's hometown. Camille came out at the end crying, taking bows, blowing kisses, and the fashion press lost its mind. Within an hour, critics were calling it the collection of the decade. Camille Ross, they wrote, had finally become the genius they always knew she was. Emma sat on the floor of her apartment for a long time. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She did something worse. She went completely, perfectly calm. And she called Marcus, and she said 5 words. "Someone has my files." Marcus wanted to pull the anniversary show immediately. Emma refused. This was her mother's tribute, and she had the originals, the history, 11 years of reputation. Surely, she thought, the truth would be obvious. 6 days later, Northern Light debuted on the final night of Fashion Week, exactly as planned. And the world saw a legendary anonymous label show 40 designs that looked like extensions of Camille Ross's triumph from 6 days earlier. Think about what that looked like from the outside. Camille showed first. Camille showed publicly, with her face, with her tears, with her story. Then a faceless label, a label that had never proven a single human being existed behind it, showed the same design language and claimed it as their own. The internet did the math in about 4 hours, and the math said Aveline was a fraud. It started as a hashtag. By morning, it was a wildfire. Aveline exposed. Aveline the thief. The mystery was never Mystique, people wrote. It was a hiding place. Fashion journalists who had worshipped the label for a decade flipped overnight because nothing sells like a fallen idol. Voss's people quietly fed the fire, leaking suggestions that Maison Vert had registered its design concepts months earlier, which was technically true because they'd registered Emma's stolen work the week they bought it. On paper, Camille had the timestamps. On paper, Emma was the copy. And Aveline couldn't fight back. That was the trap. And Voss understood it before Emma did. Any real designer would call a press conference, show their process, stand in front of cameras and defend their work. Aveline's silence, the same silence the world had found so romantic for 11 years, now read as guilt. Every day she said nothing, she looked more like a thief. 2 luxury retailers suspended their contracts within a week. A client canceled a commission worth more than Emma's building. The billionaire's wife, one of only 2 clients who knew her face, sent a message through lawyers that contained a single sentence. "I hope, for both our sakes, that you have an explanation." Marcus sat in Emma's kitchen with his head in his hands and told her the truth. "There's one move, Emma. One. You go public. Your face, your name, your mother's story, the original files, everything. You become a person. And people can believe a person." Emma stood at the window, looking down at the laundromat, at the ordinary street, at the ordinary life she had built stitch by stitch for 11 years, and she said no. There has to be another way. She was still saying that when the internet found Aveline, or rather, when it found the wrong woman. Her name was Sarah Kim. Remember that name too? Because she matters. Sarah Kim was a 51-year-old pattern maker who had freelanced for Aveline's studio for years. One of a dozen contractors who received anonymous technical drawings and sent back samples, never knowing who they truly worked for. She was talented, private, and roughly the right age. And when an amateur internet detective noticed her name on an old shipping manifest that had leaked from a courier company, a thread went viral. "I found Aveline." 12 hours later, Sarah Kim's home address was public. Her daughter's school was public. Strangers stood on her lawn filming her windows. Someone threw a brick through her car windshield with the word thief written on it. Sarah Kim, who had stolen nothing, who didn't even know whose designs she'd been sewing, gave a trembling denial on her doorstep that the internet decided was a liar's performance. That night, she was hospitalized with a cardiac episode. Emma watched the video of Sarah on that doorstep, and something inside her broke open. Because this was the moment the whole story turned inside out. For 11 years, Emma had believed her anonymity was a shield, something that protected her work, protected her mother's memory from a world that eats people. But standing in her kitchen at 2 a.m, watching an innocent woman pay for her silence, Emma understood the truth. Her shield had become a weapon, and other people were bleeding on it. Her mother's ghost wasn't in the hiding. It had never been in the hiding. It was in the hands. It was in the work. And the work was being stolen, and the innocent were being punished, and the guilty were taking bows on live television. All because Emma Hale was afraid. She called Marcus at 2:17 in the morning and said, "I'm coming out, but not the way they expect. I'm not going to defend myself. I'm going to prosecute. Here's what Voss and Camille didn't know, what nobody knew." Emma's mother had taught her one final lesson years ago in one of those back rooms, with bleeding fingers and a tired smile. "The industry will steal everything you make," her mother said. "So sign everything. Somewhere they'll never look." And Emma had. Every design Aveline ever produced, all 11 years of them, carried a hidden signature. In the technical drawings, buried in the stitch count specifications, there was always one deliberate flaw. A single embroidered star, 8 stitches instead of 9, tilted 4 degrees off its axis. The crooked star. It appeared in the underlayer of every garment, invisible unless you knew to open the lining and count. It was her mother's star, from a story about the aurora, about the one star her mother swore leaned sideways over her town like it was listening. No one had ever noticed it. It was in the files Danny stole, which meant it was in the files Voss bought, which meant if Maison Vert's atelier had followed the technical drawings faithfully, and ateliers always follow the drawings, it was sewn into the lining of every single gown Camille Ross had claimed as her own. Camille hadn't just stolen Emma's designs. She had stolen Emma's signature, and she was wearing the confession. Marcus worked for 6 days like a man half his age. He pulled the safe deposit drives with 11 years of dated originals. He hired a forensic data firm that traced the leak backward from a dark web listing to a seller account, to an IP address to a repair shop in Queens called Ridgewood Tech. And when investigators knocked on Danny's door, Danny, who was a petty thief and not a soldier, gave up the buyer's account in under an hour in exchange for a deal. The account traced to a shell company. The shell company traced to Maison Vert. And Marcus arranged one final thing. The industry's most respected trade council was holding a televised panel on the plagiarism scandal, with critics, editors, and because Voss was arrogant, Camille Ross herself, appearing as the wronged genius. Marcus called the council and told them a representative of Aveline would attend and make a statement. The news broke everything. After 11 silent years, Aveline speaks. The live stream audience that night was the largest in the council's history. Camille sat on that stage in white, poised, sympathetic, ready to forgive her faceless imitator on camera. The moderator announced the Aveline representative, and a side door opened, and a 34-year-old woman in a plain gray dress walked out, carrying a garment bag and a single old laptop covered in hardware store stickers. No one recognized her. Of course they didn't. That was the whole point of her life. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and said, "My name is Emma Hale. 11 years ago, I founded a label called Aveline. I have never shown my face before tonight, and after tonight, I hope to never show it again. I'm not here to defend my work. I am here to return a signature." You could hear the room stop breathing. She opened the laptop and walked them through it, calm and precise, like she was teaching a nervous bride to sew. The dated originals, going back 11 years, every file notarized and time-stamped years before Camille Ross had graduated design school. The forensic trail, from her rain-soaked laptop to Ridgewood Tech to the dark web listing to the shell company to Maison Vert, every link documented, every document already delivered that morning to federal investigators. The room was already spinning. And then she stood up and unzipped the garment bag and took out one of Camille's own gowns from the stolen collection, purchased legally at retail 2 days earlier. She turned to Camille and said, "You showed 22 pieces. Tell me what's sewn into the lining of every one of them." Camille's face did something the cameras would replay 10 million times, because Camille didn't know. She had never studied the drawings deeply enough to know. Emma turned the gown inside out, opened the lining along its hidden seam, and there, under the stage lights, magnified on the screens behind her, was a tiny embroidered star. 8 stitches, tilted 4 degrees. Emma said, "My mother was a seamstress. She spent 30 years making beautiful things that other people signed. She taught me to hide my name where thieves don't think to look." "That star is in all 22 of your pieces, Camille, because my hands drew every one of them, and your atelier sewed my signature without knowing what it was." She looked into the camera, into 40 million screens, and her voice didn't shake at all. "You can steal the design. You cannot steal the hands." The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then the room detonated. Camille tried to speak and produced nothing. Voss, watching from his office, was already on the phone with lawyers. But it didn't matter because Danny's confession and the financial trail had reached prosecutors before Emma ever walked on that stage. The panel was supposed to run 90 minutes. It ended in 22, the same number as the stolen gowns, and by sunrise, Maison Vert stock had lost a third of its value. Camille Ross had been dropped by every sponsor she had, and the hashtag that had spent weeks calling Aveline a thief had been rewritten by the internet into a single global chant. The hands, the hands, the hands, but Emma wasn't watching any of it. She was already gone, out the same side door, into a taxi, over the bridge, back to Queens. Because there was one thing left to do that mattered more than any of it, and it had nothing to do with fashion. The next morning, Emma Hale stood in a hospital hallway holding flowers, waiting outside the room of a 51-year-old pattern maker named Sarah Kim. She could have sent lawyers, she could have sent money, and she did send money, quietly, enough that Sarah would never need to worry again. But Emma went in person, with her face, the face the whole world had finally seen. And she sat by that bed and said, "You were hurt because of my silence, and I'm sorry, and I will spend a long time making it right." And Sarah Kim, hooked to a heart monitor, looked at the most famous designer alive and said, "Your mother would have liked that you came yourself." In the months that followed, the machinery of justice did what it does. Voss was indicted. Danny took his plea deal. Camille Ross gave a tearful interview about being deceived, and maybe she partly was. But the world had heard the word okay by then. It had come out in the depositions. And one word was all anyone needed to know about her. Maison Vert did not survive the year. And Emma? Here's the part people never guess. She did not become a celebrity. She gave no interviews, walked no red carpets, hired no publicist. She had shown her face exactly once for 22 minutes because the truth required it, and then she took her life back. She still lives in Queens. She still buys bread from Wanda. Northern Light finally debuted properly the following season, dedicated on the program to two women, a seamstress who signed her work in secret, and a pattern maker who paid for someone else's fear. Every gown still carries the crooked star, only now everyone knows to look. So, what's the lesson buried in all of this? I think it's actually two lessons stitched together. The first is about your work. In a world where anything can be copied, stolen, scraped, and resold, the only thing that can't be taken from you is the depth of what you put in. Camille could wear the design, but she couldn't answer one question about its lining. Thieves steal surfaces. They cannot steal the 10,000 hours underneath, and sooner or later, every stolen surface gets turned inside out. So, put your signature deep. Do the work so thoroughly that only you could ever explain it. And the second lesson is harder. Privacy is a right, but silence has a price. And sometimes other people pay it before you do. Emma hid for 11 years and called it strength. And for 11 years, maybe it was. But there came one night, one hospital, one innocent woman, when hiding stopped being protection and started being permission. Real courage isn't living in the light or living in the shadow. It's knowing which one the moment demands and stepping into it, even if it costs you everything you built. Emma Hale gave the world her face for 22 minutes. It was enough to burn down an empire built on a lie and to keep the one thing she'd promised her mother she'd never lose: herself. If this story hit you somewhere real, do me one favor. Hit that like button because it genuinely tells me you want more stories like this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, I'm telling the story of a janitor who spent 20 years secretly solving math problems on a university chalkboard and what happened when the professors finally found out. And before you go, answer me this in the comments. If you were Emma, would you have revealed yourself sooner or held out even longer? I read every single comment, and honestly, the debates down there are half the reason I make these videos. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.